Warm welcome, everybody. Diana and I want to thank the Romanian Cultural Institute in Stockholm for the kind invitation to present our research. This discussion will be broadcasted on Holocaust Commemoration Day 2022, and we know that many will utter their fear that the Holocaust or the memory of the Holocaust risk to be forgotten in future. Hopefully, this event can contribute to reassure you that we believe that the Holocaust will be remembered also in future, because in our research we have come across many agents who develop performative strategies which we find succeed to bridge the gap in time to these historic events. But before we come to explain what we mean by performative Holocaust commemoration, let us introduce ourselves. My name is Tanja Schult. I'm an associate professor at Stockholm University, where I teach visual and material culture. And today I speak to you from Vienna, where I'm on a sabbatical, on a research leave, and I'm a guest researcher at the Austrian Academy of Science.
Hello, everyone. My name is Diana Popescu. I'm a scholar of the Holocaust. I have a strong interest in audience reception, in memory and representation of the Holocaust in art and museum practice. And currently I'm affiliated with the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism at the University of London. And I also am a research fellow at the University of Nottingham.
And before we start to present our latest publication and explain what performative Holocaust commemoration is, maybe a few words on how this book came into being. This publication is one of the results of our 4-year research grant, which Diana and I had received already in 2015 from the Swedish Board of Science. And given this virtual Corona times afford, maybe we can say that we started this research by exchanging emails. So we sent the application back and forth. So all of you who are alone at home and frustrated over not meeting in real life, we can say that this form of cooperation started like this and ended up in a very fruitful cooperation.
Yes, and maybe this event is also a positive outcome of the pandemic, as neither Tanja or I are based in Sweden at the moment.
Yeah, yes, you're right. So, yeah, so this is just, as an encouragement to you. But today's discussion takes its departure then in the latest publication, Performative Holocaust Commemoration in the 20th Century, is the title of book, and Diana shows it to you. I don't have it here. And let me also say that we are both aware that this is an academic publication, and they are unfortunately costly and not affordable to everybody. But we can say that it is actually a republishing of a special issue, which I can show here on the camera, which is identical. And also this special issue led to an online existence. So all of you who like to download 1 or 2 articles can do this for free. You don't have to buy the book. But with this said, I still want to say that we are very grateful to Routledge that they gave us the opportunity. They approached us actually and asked for the permission to republish this volume. And I think it's a confirmation that we were tracking something which was important, that we noticed a gap in research, and that we are very grateful for the opportunity given.
Now a few words about the structure of our discussion today. We start with the book and we present what we mean by performative practices, and we'll refer to examples from this edited volume as well as from our own research. And moving on from our book, we'll also share our thoughts about what defines memory, Holocaust memory now, particularly about what we've observed as the latest developments and challenges of Holocaust memory and education in several geographical spaces that we both, Tanja and myself, are familiar with. And these include Romania, Austria, Sweden, and the UK.
Yes, and as it was actually you, Diana, who came up with the idea to frame our research application under the umbrella term performativity, I think I give you the floor first and ask you to explain why you thought the term was useful to address what interested us, namely how it could be possible to bridge the distance in time to the historic events and make Holocaust memory relevant for generations born long after.
Yes, performativity was a concept that I first came across during my doctoral studies. And when I was trying to find a way to explain what I saw was a powerful impact of works of art dealing with perpetrator memory. And I've noticed that particularly works which involve the audience in more direct ways in the artistic process, for example, by addressing the visitor directly using terms such as you, or by inviting them to contribute with an activity, with a gesture, a thought, those sort of works triggered quite powerful reactions among many participants. And I came across the work by a well-known philosopher, John L. Austin, his seminal work called How to Do Things with Words, which talked about performatives as a language which, when uttered in the right circumstances by the right people, has the power to change something about one's reality, about one's status in the world. And I found this quite interesting. And later came across the work by cultural theorist Judith Butler, who used the term performativity to explain how rituals and performances can shape one's identity and a sense of belonging in the world. So I felt that this concept could be a productive one to work with, since, as we know, many Holocaust memorial projects include a level of direct address. They ask the audience to participate, and in doing so, they try to create these bridges that Tanja was talking about between the past and the present, and to make the present more relevant. To make the past more relevant in the present.
Yeah, yes, and I'm just curious, did you also employ audience reception already in your doctoral thesis?
Yes, I did to some extent. I looked at media reception and at comments left by visitors in connection to an art installation which included performative elements. And this work was called Your Coloring Book. It was created by a young Israeli artist, Ron Katzir. And it was shown at many galleries and museums in Europe, and invited visitors to interact with a coloring book that the artist designed. And this book was based on historical photographs which were depicting the Holocaust. So this first reception study that I conducted suggested to me that performative strategies are powerful and could be transformative because many visitors commented that they perceived the subject differently after their participation in this artwork. And more generally, we know that our Holocaust memorial culture aspires to produce long-lasting changes in people. Yet when I was doing my research, there were very few empirical studies that were trying to explore the real impact they had on visitors.
Mm-hmm. So clearly, our later research was based on your foregone research, and also already in the title of the research project, which we then were granted, we addressed the issue of agencies, what are the agencies of artists, the educators, but also what sort of agency are the audiences trusted with or demanded to get engaged with. And our research project had also the title, Making the Past Present, Public Perception of Performative Holocaust Commemoration since the year 2000, since the millennium shift.
Yes, and we had noticed that there was a lack of research into audience responses and I think we wanted to make that central to our project. We wanted really to explore two main issues. The first was the current memorial practice, which encourages active participation from the audience and creates a space where the visitors can perform some acts of memorializing. And the second aspect was that we wanted to ask how participants responded, if they were transformed by their experience.
And we can come back to these different forms of audience receptions. We, or the office we asked to contribute to our volumes, employed, but maybe we start by giving a summary of the book. Maybe Diana.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. So the book includes a selection of artistic, of educational, and of memorial projects, and all in their different ways invite the visitor to participate or to take an active stance towards a subject that is being presented. And many employ elements of theater, of ritual performance to further engage the visitor or the participant. So some specific examples of works that are included in our book are, for instance, an art installation by contemporary artists Janet Cardiff and George Burres Miller, called Alter Bahnhof Video Walk, which took place in Kassel in Germany. This is discussed by Laura Bertens. We also have a collaborative art project called The Cuts, held at the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, which is discussed by Maria Dembeck. And Liat Steir looks at novel commemorative projects such as Remembrance in the Living Room, or in Hebrew Zikaron Salon, which happens in Israel. We also have a contribution from Lisa Peschel and Alan Six that explore artistic restagings of theater plays created by Jewish playwrights that were interned at Terezin camp in Czechoslovakia. As well, there is a chapter on educational projects at former campsites in Germany. This is written by Kerry Wickham. And lastly, we have a contribution from Rachel Perry, who looks at how survivors themselves reenacted some of the experiences that they had lived through in the concentration camps. Mm-hmm. As a whole, these examples, I think they point to a multitude of different forms of performative commemoration. All these examples, however, seem to be guided by an aspiration to transform individuals. And we argue that this transformation has to do with turning spectators from being passive to socially and morally responsible agents. So, or in other words, in simpler terms, we can say that these projects have to do with the pledges that we are all familiar with of never forget and never again. And they try to make these pledges real and palpable to the participants in the projects.
Yes, and of course, these are great demands, transform the visitor and so on. And of course, we were interested if the office somehow can address these questions, if the set goals are also fulfilled, but also how can, in any way, these questions be solved through research. Maybe you can say a few words how the office employed audience reception studies to interrogate if this is achieved in a way.
Yes, of course, and this is really a very central question for us, and it has been discussed by some of our contributors. For instance, Liat Steir looked at audience reception of the commemoration Remembrance in the Living Room in Israel, and she interviewed participants that were part of several commemorations, and the interviews point to the fact that performative strategies were indeed in that case effective, that participants were able to appreciate that past as not only being of relevance in their present, but also they were made to feel that they were that their participation counted, that they were part of a community of memory. So in that sense, yes, there are signs, emerging from audience research which points to how performative projects can be effective. However, current audience work is not conclusive about whether the participants are truly transformed. And as you mentioned, this can be quite a high aspiration that these projects hold. Or if participants are made to feel that they are responsible for taking, an active stance against, let's say, modern day injustices. So these questions are, they are a challenge to audience research studies, but nevertheless, I think we both feel that they need to be pursued.
Yes, and maybe I can say also why we both felt this need, this urgency to at all ask this question. And if I'm, from my personal perspective, it was a sort of frustration even, anti-Semitism was on the rise again, despite all the efforts made on teaching this historic event. There was a growing xenophobic attitude among very many different people all over Europe. And somehow, at least I felt sort of impotence, even not only frustration, that what am I doing? Does it make any sense? Does all these historic scholars, but also what we do, really help? Does it contribute to anything? And I can say that I was raised in Germany in the 70s and 80s, and I think many felt the need, but even the obligation to remember. I had dedicated half of my, at least, professional life to the subject. But yeah, I wondered maybe, has it been in wane? And I could see that a lot was going on. I mean, there was more and more forms of education, not only historical research. People were eager to transmit it through exhibitions, in museums, through films, and so on. But also there was maybe, a growing tendency that these ceremonies and also commemoration days, as the Holocaust Commemoration Day, maybe results in lip services and were empty phrases. And I thought that there is a need for an honest and serious engagement, so that we really make sure that these Holocaust imperatives are not forgotten, but taken seriously. But I also have to say that due to the results of our research, somehow I feel more confident now, because the people I then interrogated or met, came across, talked to, showed that all of those who engaged in the subject, confronted the subject, and I don't mean professionally, somehow showed a different attitude. I thought they are more self-reflective, self-critical, and also displayed a greater tendency of having empathy for people in need, refugees, for example. So, and I thought, for me personally, this connection between the past, teaching the past, and the present was important. I mean, important, I don't mean that, of course, it's also very relevant just to remember the Holocaust as what it was, but also for me personally to draw a connection between remembrance and how we act in the present. Maybe against this, you could say a few more words again on Rachel Perry's contribution to our volume, because she connects the past with practices also very relevant in the present. She talks about forms of reenactment practiced by the survivors themselves. Maybe you can say more about her article.
Yes, of course. Yes, Rachel Perry's contribution really frames our special issue, pointing out that these practices of performativity were present there really since the very beginning, and were we can find them, you know, they've been sort of employed by survivors themselves. And so Rachel looks at how survivors in the early years after they have been liberated from the camps, they attempted to let the world know of what they had been through by reenacting scenes of torture that they had witnessed themselves, or they themselves were subjected to. And these scenes were photographed, and then they acted as evidence in trials against perpetrators. So these reenactments, or we can call them performances, may appear inappropriate for us today, but they played a crucial role to provide evidence, since there was no record of all the tortures that the survivors went through. And so by reenacting them and by allowing these reenactments to be photographs, new evidence was created of something that had happened, but there was no, that kind of evidence couldn't be used in these early trials against perpetrators. So, but these reenactments also help survivors to work through, to some extent, what happened to them. And of course, they serve also as a way to remember for later generations, you know, of the horrendous experiences that they went through. And also they act as ways to remember also those who lost their lives as a result of such tortures, and that they couldn't testify. So Perry shows us that there was this performative dimension to Holocaust memory from early on, and then our other contributions show that this performative dimension can be traced in later and recent works and commemorations, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And maybe this is also very much of interest that these poems were so early, because I think then people hear of reenactments, I think maybe of young men in Wehrmacht uniforms, or of taking on the Confederate soldiers' uniforms and, you know, repeat battlefields. So maybe you can say, where would you draw the line? What is edutainment? What is performative commemoration for you?
Yes, this is an interesting question. I think in this specific case, it really depends on who is performing those scenes and for what purposes. And I think that before we rush to judge a work as being superficial or inappropriate, we could maybe take a bit of time to think and understand the context, the intentions of the creators, and then judge it accordingly, like we would do anyway with any other historical resource. So of course, I agree that that dressing up as a perpetrator, or simulations of gas chambers, or playing the victim or the perpetrator, are really very problematic, as they tend to reduce the horrors of these histories into something that is kitsch, the so-called Holocaust kitsch. So these are very damaging, I would say. And entertainment exists of the type, for instance, that is used in video games, such as, for instance, Call of Duty, which is a very popular, unfortunately, very popular video game among young people. So these forms of entertainment tend to distort history and are undermining, I would say, the good educational work that is carried out in schools and in museums. So I would hope that performative works go beyond this so-called edutainment, and as we've seen, they do not wish to offer a live experience that may be thrilling necessarily, but these works, I think, wish to provoke reflection and critical thinking. And also some of these works are quite challenging. They challenge us to look at things in a different light, and encourage us maybe to ask ourselves if the promises of never again and never forget can really be achieved. Wouldn't you agree, Tanja?
No, absolutely. And I also think that somehow we moved away from just taking a moral stand of like this and this cannot be done, or this is this, you know, that we have the courage to ask the question was very relevant. Of all, also very many well-meant forms of Holocaust commemoration succeeded to bridge the distance and time and lived up to these imperatives and the promises of never forget and never again. So I think somehow, and I want to underline this, that for us it was not to prove that something does not work or condemn it morally, but rather see what ways of approaches, strategies work, somehow reach an audience, do something, and what can it mean? What does it mean? And this has nothing to do with the sort of neoliberal demand on things have to pay off. That is not. I think for us it was much more important to feel that we felt a commitment to the Holocaust survivors and all those who are dead. That also, of course, there are limited resources. We have to think of where is the money spent and somehow reassure ourselves that what we did make sense. So somehow was the balance. I think that we actually did what we didn't say anyone else was doing, namely really to ask, do they work? Do they do something? What do they do for whom? Not for everybody, of course.
Yes, and we saw that we definitely found compelling examples showing that some of these strategies do work. And we found these examples not only in the field of commemoration, but we also looked at Holocaust education, for instance. So Tanja, how does our book address this topic? Was there any one article in the book that you would like to mention addressing the topic of Holocaust education?
Yes, if I have to choose one, I pick Carrie Wickham's article, and the title is Reading the Traces, Embodied Engagement with a Past at 3 former Nazi concentration camps. And I think Wickham takes up developments which are important both in Holocaust commemoration and also maybe more general in at memorial sites, dealing also with other subjects, but in museums practices, in at least current day democracies. So what I think what he shows or investigates is the varying degrees of agency visitors are offered. So first and foremost, he is of course exploring 3 sites which once were concentration camps: Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald and Ravensbrück, and all these were located in former East Germany. And of course, all of these 3 places pay much attention to the fact that these were sites of atrocities, you know, authentic sites where the atrocities took place. And this was also something which is of importance. I mean, this is a reason why people come to these sites, because they think that if they come to the places where the atrocities have happened, they somehow get a connection. They can also more imagine, understand how all this happened. But these places have changed dramatically very often. And Wickham looks at the strategies, how these 3 memorial sites respond to these expectations, and he highlights how the educational staff in Ravensbrück succeeds to encourage visitors to make the space their own.
Well, that's interesting. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about Ravensbrück and also about how educators chose to approach their visitors.
Yes. Yes, right. Ravensbrück was the largest women's camp during the Holocaust. Over 100,000 women and children, and later on also men, were imprisoned here. And much of our architecture was actually destroyed. So, and also in contrast to other memorial sites, here the barracks were not rebuilt. So what can be shown in such a place? So the educators in Ravensbrück made a very interesting choice. So they invite visitors to explore the site first on their own and maybe they find a place which they find for some reason particularly interested, and then they come back to the educators and initiate a conversation. And there are two options. If there is a school class, a larger class, they took photos and then they use the classroom to talk about these places through the images. Or in this case, if it's a smaller group, if there are individuals, the educator goes together with the people to this specific site, and then they engage in the conversation. And what I think is so interesting here is that, you know, you are asked to explore the site on your own, and the guide then also, of course, maybe, you know, when you in a memorial site, traditionally you have a script, you have a live guide, you say the same thing all over again, and maybe 3 times a day. It's just exhausting, and you never reach the limit of everything you can say. In this new way of engaging with the audiences, which I don't say is totally novel in education, but it is not commonly practiced in these memorial sites, the educators get the chance to also tell much more, and maybe have an interesting way of engagement because the questions are different, but also there's a different form of engagement between the educator and the person who asked, because these people are taken seriously. It is also something you already addressed, referring to the other article. They are seen, their interests are answered, and then maybe also, you know, they are corrected, because these educators can come up with all the knowledge, and maybe they go wrong with the expectations on the place, and the stereotypes they had can be encountered. So I don't say it's revolutionary, but it's not top down, this approach. And yeah, and I don't say neither that this is a life transforming experience, maybe, but I think the chance to explore this space on your own maybe could lead to that it is more memorable, and then in the end it stays with you, and it maybe is like a tool of remembrance, keeps coming back to you and give you some historic and maybe even ethical guiding in your life.
Yeah, I think this example is fascinating, and I think it's really the way that the visitor is sort of you know, acknowledged within that space, and the space for dialogue that this educational project allows. I think that sounds to be quite unique. Do you think that's specific to that site, to Ravensbrück, or have you found traces of similar approaches in other educational programs today?
First of all, I also have to admit that I have not been to Ravensbrück myself, but entirely built my judgment on Wickham's experience. And I don't know if it's unique for memorial sites, but rather I think it is maybe symptomatic how for trends within education and museum practices. And I think it has much to do that there is a different attitude in democratic societies, at least, because we look at the role of the citizens in a different way. I mean, the Homo democraticus is asked to be engaged, interested, seeking knowledge on their own, and then contribute to collective memory. And Wickham refers back to Homo sacer, who this was the term which described the prisoner in the camp, you know, reduced basically on a biological being, meant to be disciplined in the camp, dehumanized, and a thing to get rid of. And the Homo democraticus is, of course, something totally different. So in this way, these forms of educational programs display an entirely different understanding on the role of citizens, because, you know, it's a totally different ideological system. And I think this is promising. But now we talked a lot about Wickham. So have you seen maybe similar changes in educational programs you have worked on?
Yes, yes, I have done, but not to the extent I think that you describe or Kerry Wiggum describes in his contribution. I was reminded as you spoke about what you said about a change of attitude, and I think I've recognized that in quite a lot of educational programs in the UK. I'm, for instance, reminded of the educational program at the Imperial War Museum, which, for those who don't know, it's the Britain's National War Museum, and it's the only museum that has hosts a major Holocaust exhibition. They actually revamped their old exhibition. They've opened a brand new space, a new gallery, new Holocaust galleries and Second World War galleries actually in October last year. So educators in this museum, I think, do adopt some of the principles of what can be called constructivism in learning, which basically means that one puts the visitor or the learner at the center of the learning process. Visitors are invited to construct meaning out of historical sources and the information that they are given, as well as they are encouraged to interrogate the sources. To reflect on what these sources mean in the context of that exhibition and more broadly. So this approach, I think, that they have in the current exhibition is also found in their former Holocaust exhibition, which I have researched to some extent. It was especially used, I would say, in an audio guide, which I've studied, that asks visitors quite directly to reflect on different questions that are raised by, let's say, the artifacts or the photographs that one encounters as they go along in the exhibition. So I can give you an example. For instance, when visitors arrive at the historical photographs that depict the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, the audio guide makes them aware, for instance, of the biased nature of the photographic material that they see there. So, for instance, visitors are told, you are seeing the victims through the eyes of the perpetrators. I think that, you know, one rarely sees in Holocaust exhibitions, you know, an audio guide that actually explains through whose eyes we are glancing when we look at photographs. And then they say they encourage a sort of critical thinking from the visitor. So they say, knowing this, do you think these pictures or pictures like this shouldn't be displayed? Or do you think it's more important that the truth of what the Nazis did to innocent people be seen, whatever the origin of the image? So this sort of questioning, I think, stimulates, I would say, young people to think about the complexities of displaying problematic, source materials that are produced by perpetrators. And I think that they can raise awareness that by looking at these sources, one perceives this history through a certain lens. Mm-hmm. So I think that we can see maybe a performative dimension already embedded in some of the pedagogical approaches that promote, let's say, visitor-led learning. But I think equally it is very important to understand, I think, how visitors themselves respond to such questions and whether the audio guide actually influenced how they approach the topic or not. And it's kind of research is really, I think, in my opinion, is less common, I would say. How do you approach this, Tanja? Do you think audience reception should be central?
Well, I think I recognized upon preparing this conversation, I thought that there are more and more museums also who have a trend to ask themselves how visitors reply to their exhibitions, and I think this has become more and more common, and I think it is an honest way to engage with the visitors to improve their exhibitions, but also I think there's still a lack of independent research. maybe you can say more how audience receptions have developed. Because I think, you know, this could be a valuable tool both for educators, but maybe even for artists to know how these works really work.
Yeah. Yes, I think this is really an important question, and historically, you know, artists, and I think probably more recently artists and museum educators are trying to understand what the impact is, and trying to shape or to update, you know, their exhibitions to address, you know, some of these things. But still, I feel that most of the research done in museum spaces, I think it's quite targeted at specific issues, things that, let's say, relate to you know, to specific learning outcomes that they are looking to achieve, and a lot of it is driven from the museum itself. So it's not really conducted by researchers, let's say, or less so. I would say things are changing. But let me go back to your question, and I think that yes, I think that audience studies are really important. I would say that much more could be done to conduct such studies and to look into in depth at how visitors learn, and you know, what they feel, how they react to maybe specific elements of an exhibition or a work of art, and maybe in a broader sense how they make sense of their experience. I think that important is also that these studies are done by external researchers who usually don't have a stake or direct stake in those projects. So they are not guided by specific agendas, let's say. And as you say, you know, educators and artists, I think, should know their audiences and should maybe more actively seek this feedback, or even create spaces within their works to integrate the voices of the audience. I think this can be done in different ways. There are traditional ways to do this sort of research, but also more creative ways. I think a combination of these would work best. So, for instance, one can do this sort of research is traditionally done by means of surveys, interviews, focus groups, but also one can also use modern technologies, for instance, eye or gaze or movement tracking, or use photography, as you mentioned in the case of Ravensbrück, or even specially developed phone apps. So I think that there are a range of methods available, and I feel that it's important that one combines different methods of gathering visitor responses. I think that would be more beneficial. So moving on, I feel that during our 4 years of research on our project, we have both cooperated on some publications, and also we have published independently. And if we leave the book aside, what other cases, Tanja, have you published on that maybe you would like to mention in particular? Maybe cases that you would describe as successful in terms of bridging that distance to the past?
Yeah, absolutely. And the one which comes to my mind immediately, of course, is Christoph Meyer's The Invisible Camp, Audio Walk Gusen, produced already in 2007. This work comes back to me, and I keep returning to this work on a number of occasions, actually. And I think it's a perfect case study for our discussion. First of all, because it's invisible, so we don't have any slideshow here to illustrate the works so well. So there are no images which would illustrate the work as such, but also because this isn't a perfect example where an artist was clearly interested to know how the work was perceived, not necessarily if someone liked it or disliked it, but if they understood it, if they could follow it, because I know that he worked with audience reception studies already through the creative process. So when he had parts of our audio walk ready, he asked his father and colleagues of his who were all craftsmen to listen to it and walk these passages, and had some surveys, you know, to evaluate if it worked. But I'm carried away. Maybe I should explain what this work is about very, very shortly. It's a complex work. I've written a lot about it, but this work is based on a site which once was a concentration camp, or several actually, Gusen. It is an area close to Linz and very close to Mauthausen, also seen very often as a twin camp. But in contrast to Mauthausen, that was not turned into a normal site, but there were houses built. It's a residential area. So, and that happened already in the 50s, 60s. So when Christoph Meyer then started to do this creative work, there were houses built on the former concentration camps. So what he does is to lead visitors through the area, and it takes 96 minutes. And it has really nothing to do with an audio guide known from memorial sites. So it's not like a historian or educator tells you this is that and this is that, but it's an artistic audio collage built on several voices, on survivors, even perpetrators, highly uncomfortable at times, but also of inhabitants, you know, of people who have to live in these places today. And then a couple of philosophical questions are raised, and you are still guided through the area and sometimes pointed to a house which once was the brothel in the camp. So you get an idea of a place, but also an idea of what it means to live in such a place. And again, he cooperated with the people who live in the area. Many helped him to measure the steps necessary to come to a certain place, so that this work also works artistically so well. But there are a few things I want to highlight, because I think this work is so important because it doesn't give any chance to identify with someone. I mean, you are constantly thrown from one perspective to another, but you are thrown also through different times, you know, like the history of a place and the now. And you really have to find your own position. And somehow what I felt that this work works so well in many ways.
That's really interesting, Tanja. I wish I could have been there in Austria to take this walk. So could you tell us more about how do you know this works?
Yeah, how do I know? Actually, because I did audience reception, and clearly this project profited from being a 4-year project. So we had the time to develop the questions we wanted to address and find cooperation partners, and that was incredibly important. That I found a very interested educator, Bernhard Mühleder from the Memorial Gusen, who distributes the MP3 players, which you need to go the walk, and also collects them after it. And then he distributed the surveys for me, and also somehow ensured that the surveys were filled in. So I had over 100 surveys. But what I also want to highlight, I do not only say that there were questions and then I could say, yes, they also like the work or something, but the answers, which were often very comprehensive, informed the way I wrote about the work. And they really also was somehow a smash in my arrogant face as a researcher, because they proved me wrong, because I thought the work is maybe too complicated, too demanding of visitors. But the people who answered, they said it's demanding, but they appreciated that this very complex history is not simplified, but that they were themselves taken seriously. And they definitely said they could recommend it to others. And I also followed up these questions, and this work made a huge impression on them. So never underestimate your audience. From a lorry driver to a sound artist, this work is appreciated and I think widely understood. That was very important to me. And well, it's a complex work, there's much to say. I published a couple of articles, even in the latest one is to be published soon in a volume you edit at the moment. You maybe can say a few words on this volume, and then we maybe have to move on quickly as time is short.
Yes, sure. I think, first of all, I think I completely agree with what you mean by never underestimate the audience. I think I had similar insights, from the audience research I've done, and the volume that will come out will look specifically at visitor experience. This time in a broader context, in the case of Holocaust museums and memory sites, both in Europe and elsewhere. And the book will be published by Routledge, like our previous volume. And I think this book would like to offer a more comprehensive insight into how visitors respond to, this time, as I said, a wide range of museum exhibitions, memorials, and memory sites. And what is interesting here is that each contributor proposes different methods of gathering material, of gathering visitor responses, and so it is quite promising, and I'm looking forward to having that published. But going back maybe to your work on Bussen, it becomes clear from what you mentioned that what we describe as performative maybe doesn't depend necessarily on integrating certain media or new media, but it is rather about a kind of attitude. Would you like to say more about that?
Yeah, I think this is something very important because interestingly, this work was perceived as novel. But if you think of what sort of technique it used, even, 15 years ago, even then the MP3 player or the Walkman was an old device. The way he does it was novel, but today you have augmented reality. You could go through this area and really use your smartphone and place images on this specific site, but still young people appreciate it and appreciate it as novel. And why is this, Afford? Why do they describe it in this terms? And I think it has very much to do with what we describe as performative, that it gets to you. There's a form of intimacy and immediacy resulting from the way it is done, and that in Christoph Meyer's audio walk is a sort of mix of collages of different voices of the here and now and of sound, but it really doesn't depend on the media used, but it's more the attitude of engagement demanded from the viewer, but also put into the work. And you can find this attitude in much earlier works. If you go to the 80s, in our introduction, we take up Jochen and Esther Schalev, Hamburg-Harburg Memorial. This is a well-known monument which was a pillar, and here also audiences were asked to participate, to maybe write their names on the surface of a concrete, and then the pillar sunk into the ground. And the artists were also very keen on saying, no, in the end, it depends on us. During that period, it also was, of course, a way to get audiences engaged in the process of confronting the past. While in Christoph Meyer's case, 2007, that is maybe not the same urgency, but the urgency to get the user engaged stays the same. And again, it is the user who then becomes the walking memorial. In the other case, you get engaged and something happens, and in the end you should transport the memory and the lesson you've learned, but now you enact this in a form, a walking memorial. You make a statement you want to remember, but also by doing this walk through this residential area, it becomes clear to others, you know, when you stop, you point at things, you sit down, you are the one going this walk, you remind these people to remember. And I think somehow here these forms of engagement does matter. Be taken seriously, have an emotional engagement, display this maybe also openly. And what I want to say, just we don't have the time to go into this, but I think these forms known from Holocaust commemoration have been very influential also when it comes to remember other painful and traumatic pasts, like for example slavery in the US. I just mentioned the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which a monument erected in Montgomery, Alabama in 2018, which for many which relates to this form of engagement, and that is maybe also very important. But I think this audience who listens to us today is very much also interested in the countries you have worked on, especially of course on Romania, the place, the country you have been born in, and maybe also you can say something on England, where you are living right now.
Yeah, sure. I could say a few words about the memory cultures of these countries, and especially as I feel that maybe memory culture in Romania perhaps is less well known. So I think that this would be a great opportunity to say a bit more about that. So just, we'll start with just the basics, that these countries obviously occupied very different positions during the World War II. Romania was a collaborator and supporter of Germany before it switched sides at the end of, towards the end of the war, to the liberator countries. And the UK has been involved as opposing Germany and from the very beginning, and it's one of the liberator countries with a significant role to play in liberating the camps and also providing shelter for survivors. So, but beyond, I would say, beyond these classifications, I would say that each of these countries have complex and not always generous attitudes towards the Jews and other persecuted groups. They both have a history of racism, which involved both being involved in slavery, Romania having enslaved its Roma populations in the 19th century, and Britain being obviously heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade, and as we know, being the originator of the notion of eugenics, which was a term coined in 1883 by Sir Francis Galton. But I won't go into much detail about that. Just to say that Holocaust memory in these countries is strongly shaped by the positions that these countries took during the Second World War. And in the UK, the memory of the Kindertransport is central. Kindertransport refers to the operation to rescue Jewish children from Nazi-occupied territories, from Austria, Czechoslovakia, and also Germany. And in the UK, Kindertransport is really there's a lot of educational work, a lot of exhibitions, and even memorials dedicated to this episode in history. But I would also like to point out that less remembered, for instance, in the UK, are the domestic workers. Compared to the 10,000 children that were rescued, there were about 20,000 domestic workers that were mostly Jewish women that came to work for Jewish and non-Jewish homes in the UK. And they are often seen as sort of the forgotten refugees. They are less remembered. So I think that it's important to acknowledge what is and what is not remembered in countries like the UK and Romania. I would say that in the UK, the recent Black Lives Matter movement also had implications for Holocaust memory. There is some interest in discussing the Holocaust as part of maybe larger histories of persecution, such as the slave trade. There's obviously, of course, some opposition to this as well. While Holocaust is a mandatory subject in British schools, history of the slave trade is not. So we'll have to see what the near future brings. Yes. Could I now switch to talk a bit about Romania, Tanja?
Yeah, I think we should. We also need to keep the time, and I think Romania would be very much of interest to this audience. Yeah, please.
Great. So to say, well, in Romania, I think that Holocaust memory has been really largely absent from the public discourse since the communist regime took over after the Second World War. And I think it was only after the Iron Curtain, the fall of the Iron Curtain, and of the Ceausescu regime in 1989, that we can speak of a possibility to remember the horrors of the World War II. To give a bit of a historical background, the Romanian government ruling during the Second World War was headed by Marshal Ion Antonescu, who espoused anti-Semitic and anti-Romani attitudes and was very directly responsible, together with the Legionar, paramilitary fascist group, for the murder of Jews in many cities across Romania, and for the deportation of Jews and the Roma in labor camps in Transnistria, which is now in the south of what is now Ukraine. Then it was a territory under the Romanian influence. So this dark chapter in Romania's history only started to creep in the 2000s, I would say, after Romania joined NATO and other establishments such as the European Union. And the Romanian state has officially acknowledged the country's role in perpetrating the Holocaust. This official acknowledgement was really driven by a few things. In 2004, the Romanian government commissioned an international commission made out of researchers to study the Holocaust in Romania. And based on this research and the conclusions of this research, it was publicly acknowledged by the Romanian government that the Romanian government at that time was primarily responsible for the murder of something between 280,000 to 380,000 Jews and over 11,000 Romani people. And Romania is a kind of a paradoxical case, because half of the Jewish population was murdered, and half of the Jewish population dwelling particularly in the south of Romania was saved. I would say that there are other developments in the official Romanian memory culture that are quite important since this acknowledgement. In 2005, for instance, the Elie Wiesel Institute for the Study of the Holocaust opened in Bucharest, and then in 2006. Since 2006, actually, the Holocaust is taught in high school. And another important moment was 2009, when the Holocaust Memorial in central Bucharest had opened, and it was hoped that it would raise public awareness of the historical atrocities. So I think that we can speak about that there is really an established official memory of the Holocaust in Romania.
And maybe also you can say a few words on what maybe defines Holocaust memory in Romania right now.
Sure. I think that going back to the developments I mentioned earlier, it's important to say that these are welcome and they show a willingness to assume historical responsibility. But I sense that there is still no sustained public debates dealing with this topic. So what I mean is debates that are involving Romanian shapers of public opinion, let's say intellectuals, academics, writers, artists, journalists, and nothing that can be compared to the intense debates that we can observe in Romania in connection to the Holocaust past. So I'll argue that Romania's public memory is stimulated not so much by public debates that are traditionally triggered by memorials or monuments, like we see in the case of Germany and Austria, but is more driven by popular culture, and here particularly by films. Films, for instance, such as Radu Jude's The Dead Nation and other films that deal with problematic aspects of Romanian's history. Another interesting film that I would like to mention is by Florin Iepan, a documentary film about Odessa, which I feel it was one of the most daring in that it tackles the massacres committed by the Romanians in Odessa. And the film is interesting because it also captures attitudes from Romanian public. So you can see that there are two main attitudes. One is that of disbelief, and the other one is indifference at the news, of the fact that Romania has committed its own Holocaust against its Jewish and Roma people. So I would say that current Romanian public memory is shaped by these two conflicting positions: the official position, which acknowledges this history, and still a prevailing disinterest in this chapter of history. But I would also say, and would like to emphasize, that there are changes that, for instance, Radu Jude's film that they mentioned raised quite a lot of public interest, and this was followed by debates that were covered in the media, both national and international media. And there are other projects like Olga Ștefan's grassroots initiative called The Future of Memory, who also uses documentary film to raise awareness about the past. And she has shown film projections in different parts of Romania. More recently, Romania will open a museum dedicated to the history of Jews in Romania and to the Holocaust. And the subject will become mandatory in Romanian schools. So we can see that there are quite a lot of steps forward. Nevertheless, a recent poll by the Elie Wiesel Institute showed that while 90% of Romanian feel that the Holocaust is important and should be commemorated, and also condemn the Holocaust, very few associated with Romania. It is. Let's hope that this awareness will grow as the Holocaust is introduced as a mandatory subject in schools. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is very relevant for the audience, but also for because this country may not be so much known to others, in terms of Holocaust commemoration. Was there any other subject or any other examples you'd like to take up?
Not at the moment, but Tanja, would you like to say anything more about one of the countries that you're living currently, or maybe just very briefly?
Yeah, very briefly, maybe. I just say why I don't want to give both we run out of time, but also I think there's for me a tendency in research which has left the national state and rather sees how Holocaust memory has globalized, universalized, and we maybe can just very briefly say a few words about this. I mean, when you think about the Gusenwalk, I mean, it was an Austrian artist, but actually he's living in Berlin since, I don't know, a couple of decades, I guess. And so he was, of course, also impacted by what happened there in terms of Auseinandersetzung, confronting the past. So this is something he takes back to Austria then. But of course, it is realized in Austria. So is this now Austrian Holocaust memory, or is European memory? Or, for example, the last huge memorial which has opened in quite recently at the end of 2021, it was the Wall of Names, which is a very traditional form of commemoration. I mean, such memorials you find in Sweden from the 80s and 90s onwards, actually. But it took this particular survivor 20 years to get it realized. Would you now say this is a dramatic change in Austrian memory culture? No, because rather, I think there was an individual who fought bravely for the realization of a monument, but actually there is also somehow a tendency of political instrumentalization by a government, which not necessarily is what we would say in all aspects confirming, have a serious engagement with the topic, to leave this aside for a moment. So what I want to say also that, when I look at Austrian memory culture, for me, it's very difficult at the moment when I'm confronted with it to give a general statement, because I suddenly feel like being placed in aspects which were relevant when I lived in Germany. They still are. This is still very urgent to confront the past in many ways. I stumble across different memorials and exhibitions and so on constantly. Still, I also remember discussions we had when we wrote about the Rudlička memorial from the late 80s, that there is still maybe in some certain circles the idea of Austria having been Hitler's first victim, and this victim myth maybe also is consistent. What I want to say with this, there's maybe not a general attitude and not even official or private, but that all these things are happening at the same moment in the country, and that maybe Holocaust memory is, as democracy, never really accomplished, and it's continuous work and will adapt also to the needs of the time. And this, with this I mean both technological developments, but also how societies are changing.
Yes, for sure. And would you like to say anything else about maybe perhaps Sweden?
Well, Sweden has also, if you don't go back to the history, because I think that would take too much time, we maybe could briefly take up the example of the stumbling stones, which are also a very well-known memorial project, once illegally brought into the public by artist Gunther Dömnich in Germany and Cologne. Today, widely appreciated, well known. There are over 70,000 Stolpersteine, stumbling stones in Europe, and some even overseas. And Sweden received the 3 stumbling stones, the first, and so far, to my knowledge, were the only 3 existing in Stockholm in 2019. And very briefly, what is important here? I mean, on the one hand, of course, you can notice that Sweden has arrived at a form of European collective memory on the Holocaust by also having these stones in Stockholm, in the capital, and it was the Forum for Living History, state institutions which was behind this, not individuals like in many other places. And why do they have seen to it that they are placed there? Yeah, to tune into these forms of commemoration, but also because I think the attitude has changed. I mean, from shifting a view of having been a neutral country, revisiting their neutral position, the enormous shift which happened 42, 43, when they acknowledged that being Jewish is a form, is a reason why you should get what we call asylum today. But when you find these stones, you would wonder, why do they are in Sweden? Because people seek refuge in Sweden, but they were expelled. They were not allowed to stay. And so the attitude then in Sweden today is, well, we maybe you know, we were not perpetrators, we were not occupied, but we definitely were not free of responsibility. If we had had another policy during these early years, already in the 30s and the beginning of the 40s, these people would have survived. And this is maybe interesting with these stones, that they are placed there, but also that I think that they have a different meaning in different national contexts. It's still true, because in Germany they are very well known. In Sweden they are not so well known, and especially when I talk about them with my international students, they sometimes wonder what they are about. But if you know that there are 70,000 stones, today I look at them in a different way, because I know of this huge memorial project. And what I feel today is not necessarily only to think of the individual who lived in this particular house, but I think there's a community out there who wants to remember these crimes. And this community is invisible at the moment, but I feel it. And then we come back to these forms of performative commemoration, I think, which is important to us, that there is, you know, somehow we feel like we are not alone. That's not the only person in the world who wants to commemorate these events.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And I think that when you mentioned that there's an invisible community, that, you know, this project is really relying on them, because actually it is initiated by people who, individuals who do research and then approach the artist who comes to place the stone in their spaces. So those people, you know, that are the drivers of memory, you know, we are reminded of them as well when we stumble upon these stones. Yeah, it's really interesting. And I should also mention that the project is also now, you can find stumbling stones in Romania as well. In 2014, there was an initiative called Another Kind of History, or Historia Altfel, that pursued this project. And the first stumbling block this was installed in west part of Romania, in Timișoara. So in a way, Romania is now part of what you've discussed about is part of this transnational culture of memorialization, that, you know, and it is hoped that maybe alongside film, these immediate maybe memorials can be more effective on the ground in raising public awareness.
And I realize the time has passed. I'm sitting now almost in the dark. So I realize we have to come to an end. Maybe you say a few more words on what you think are current trends in Holocaust commemoration today, very briefly, before we end.
Yes, of course. Yes, so in the UK, at least, I've noticed that in recent years, there's been a push towards, especially from higher education, towards decolonizing the curricula. And we've also seen in the UK the toppling of statues dedicated to slave owners, like Edward Colston in Bristol. So I think that these recent shifts also affect how we remember the Holocaust. There's definitely more work in academic and both museum level, which aims to speak about anti-Semitism in relation to racism, and places the Holocaust within this larger history of racism, looking at the roots of racism that go beyond the Holocaust. So I think this notion implicates not just Germany and other perpetrator countries, but also many other nations who are espousing these racist ideologies in the past and in the present. So I also notice a scholarly level. I notice, for instance, that books by Michael Rothberg in particular, who developed the notions of implicated subject and multi-directional memory. I feel that these are very useful ways to open up comparisons that do not diminish the uniqueness of the Holocaust, but invite a reflection about what is common, how these histories of persecution connect to one another. And I've also, a third thing that I've noticed is the and we've touched upon this already, is the coexistence of multiple practices of memory. I noticed that alongside performative practices, a more recent development that I could perhaps call it immersive memory, which is facilitated by new immersive technologies, by technologies like virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality. Of course, they pose new questions to us. But I noticed there is an increasing number of projects such as Dimensions in Testimony, The Last Goodbye, or the Anne Frank Annex, that invite the public to step into virtual reconstructions of campsites, or to carry out virtual dialogue with survivors, which is facilitated by artificial intelligence. So I think these projects also aspire to make the past present and palpable somehow on a visceral level. And I think that while performative memorial projects generally required a sense of being there physically, with the pandemic, our understanding of being there has changed. And so it's somehow reproduced in the digital space through these immersive VR projects. So I would say that performative practices coexist with other sort of new forms of addressing the memory of the Holocaust.
Okay, I think these were very valuable observations, and we don't have to tackle all forms of Holocaust research and commemoration, but we have compiled a list of literature, at least on our publications relevant, which will be shown just in a second. But with these insights, I think we both want to thank the Romanian Institute again for giving us the chance to present our book and the other research we have done.
And to say this in Romanian, mulțumim pentru invitație din nou. Sperăm că această discuție a fost interesantă și a meritat timpul dumneavoastră. Mulțumim.
So thank you. Tack så mycket. That was it from us. Bye-bye.